For this video, we're going to create a new project. We're going to leave the default settings here again, and we are going to again create a project from template and use the command line app template. Up here, we're going to call this classes and objects example for a name. And down here in the base package, I'll have you note what it says here. It says DKSTUMMI Now, it's not important what it says down here, as long as you mentally note that it says something down here. So we need to recall what it says here later in the video. So now we've created our project. We are where we usually are when we start out. And this time around, before we start writing any code, I like to divert your attention to this window over here. We haven't talked much about the project window so far, but for this video, this becomes very relevant. So here in the project window, we'll see that we have our project up here with an arrow next to it that we can expand on. So if we expand it, we see that there's a couple of folders below here. There's one called .ide and there's one called src. We'll go and expand the src folder, and down here we'll see the name that were specified under package when we created the project. Well, it's not important what your package is called this time. Of course, we need to now sort of understand that what we're specifying as a package is where our main class, as we'll get back to in a bit, is created. That's it. That is all we need to know about that for now. We'll get back to packages in a later video. Then here we see that we have created a main class. This is because we used a template where we asked it to create a main class for us, and we also asked it to populate that main class with a public static void main method, and this is of course where our Java program starts. Now we are going to leave the main class for now, and then we are going to right click on whatever your package is up here. We're going to click on new, and we're going to click on Java class. And here we are going to give our class a name. For this example here, I'm going to call the class person, because person is something which is quite easily relatable. What I'm actually doing here is I'm creating an abstraction for a person inside of my object-oriented program. So what does a person in my program constitute? Well, we know that a class constitutes three elements: attributes, constructors, and methods. We're going to start out with the attributes. So what sort of attributes could we associate with a person? Well, a given person has a name, and we use attributes if we want to model that in our OOP program to reflect that. So that means that as an attribute, I could choose to have a public string name, and this means that objects of the type person now all have a name. We could also say that a person should have an age in our program, so we could write public int age, which means that now all objects of the class person also have an age. Now, how do we specify the value of the name attribute and the value of the age attribute? Well, to that end, we use constructors. So a constructor looks something along the lines of this. It starts out with public, then the name of the class, no return type or anything, just the name of the class, and then parentheses as we know them with parameters inside. Now these parameters we can use to initialize our attributes values. I'll get back to how we do it in a bit, but to begin with we need an parameter to represent the name. So I'm going to write a string, and I'm going to give it a slightly different name, pname, for this parameter, and I'm going to do the same thing for age, ph, this way. So intuitively, of course, I would have chosen to call this name and age because they reflect basically the same thing, but they are not the same thing. These values are specified somewhere else where people are calling the constructor, and we'll get back to how we call that in a different video. But for now we should know that this comes from outside of the class, right? These are the values that we can interact with down in our body here. And the way that we're going to interact with these values is that we're going to use these values to assign values to our attributes. So I'm going to say that name, our attribute name, is going to be equal to the value of the pName parameter, and the value of our attribute age is going to be equal to the value of the attribute or the parameter pH. So here you see why I couldn't have chosen the same name, because if I had done it like this, right, and I wrote that down here, right, I'm writing name equals name. Now, in this case, actually what's going to happen is I'm going to refer to the attribute both of the times. Oh, sorry, I'm going to refer to the parameter both of the times, which is of course unfortunate, right? Because this means that nothing happens with my attribute. There are ways around that enables us to use the same name for an attribute as a parameter, but we'll not cover this for now. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to call this pName to distinguish it from the attribute, like this. And down here we're going to write pName like this. And now we have a clear distinction between what is our attributes and what is our parameters. This is our constructor done. Now our constructor assigns values to our attributes, but of course for now we're not using these attributes for anything. How to use the attributes? Well, we could implement a method. So of course we could have opted to implement more constructors if we chose to have more constructors or more ways of constructing person objects, but for the sake of this example we'll leave it at one constructor. Now we're going to implement a method. Now here, as we are implementing a method, of course we need to remember the return type. In this case the return type is void, which means that this method does not return anything. We're going to call it getInfo, and we're going to leave the parentheses empty, which means that this one has no parameters. It can be called without parameters. Indeed, it can't be called with parameters, as this is of course the method signature up here. Down here we're going to make two statements. Both of them are system out print ln statements, and here we are going to write my name is, and out here we're going to write plus name in order to have this string here combined with the string that it gets from name. So this means that this line of code here will print out my name is and then the value of the attribute name. And down on the second line we're going to write out system out println my age is, and then of course we're going to do the same thing with age, which means that this statement down here will print out a line of text containing the text my age is and then the value of age, which is being converted implicitly to string with this statement down here. Alright, now we've constructed our first class. We've called that class person. We've added two attributes to the class, name of type string and age of type int. We've added a single constructor to the class. We've provided this constructor with two parameters, which means that in order to call the constructor on person, we need to specify values for two parameters, namely a name, pName, and a pH parameter of type string and int, respectively. We're using these values that we get from whoever calls the constructor here to assign values to our attributes. And then when people are calling the getInfo method, what is happening is that we will print out my name is and then the value of the attribute name, and we'll print out my age is and then the value of the attribute age. In the next screencast video, we're going to utilize this class to create objects.